Dobré odpoledne, dámy a pánové. Je mi velkou ctí vás přivítat na třetí bolzánovské přednášce, kterou přednese profesor Lord Rees, Martin Rees z Univerzity v Cambridge. Mám velkou radost, že tuhle akci můžeme spolupořádat s Matematicko-fyzikální fakultou Univerzity Karlovy spolu jako Učená společnost. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you at the third Boltzmann lecture that will be delivered by Professor Sir Martin Rees from the University of Cambridge. And it makes me particularly happy that we can co-organize this event together with the Faculty of Mathematics and Physics of the Charles University, co-hosting as the Learned Society of the Czech Republic. And I will not steal any more of your time, and I will pass it to the Dean of the Faculty of Mathematics and Physics, Mirko Rokita, please.
Thank you very much. I'm also not going to steal very much time from you. I just want to say, as a Dean of the Faculty of Mathematics and Physics, Charles University, and in the name of the faculty, that I am very glad that we have been given the opportunity to welcome in Prague, or I should say virtually in Prague, Professor Martin Rees. Maybe that's all what I want to say. I just want to finish this short notice by two quotes, because I like quotes, maybe 2.5. So the author of the first quote is Professor Rees himself, and the quote reads, "In the beginning there were only probabilities." So I'm glad that the probability of the lecture of Professor Rees has reached the value 1 in this room and in this Zooming session. And the second quote is inspired by the quote of Albert Einstein, who said, "Watch the stars and learn from them." And therefore I would like to finish by saying, listen to the Martin Rees and learn from him. I wish you all a pleasant journey to the year 2050 and beyond.
Okay, let me continue. I am Jiří Bičák from Institute of Theoretical Physics of Faculty of Mathematics and Physics. And it's a special honor, but I would say personal pleasure, that I can welcome here Martin Rees. Lord Rees, Baron Rees of Ludlow, but Martin says that actually these titles, as beautiful as they are, belong to United Kingdom. So I will just use Professor Rees and sometimes Martin, because I realize that it's exactly now half a century, because it was in the spring 1971 when we first met at Caltech. Now, let me say a few words for those who did not visit our Bolzano lectures previously about these first two and about Bolzano himself. So perhaps why Bolzano? Bolzano was an extremely interesting figure, born in 1781, so actually we shall have on 5th of October, which is exactly the date also of the birth of Václav Havel. We will have 240th anniversary from the birth of Bolzano. Bolzano was very deep and very original mathematician, but originally he was a priest. And he created the things which today carry his name, like Bolzano-Weierstrass theorem or the Bolzano-Cauchy theorem. And because we have Martin Rees today, so I should say that I was happy to find out in the book by John North called The Measure of the Universe that 3 pages are dedicated to Bolzano. He distinguishes clearly what is bounded space, what is infinite, what is unbounded, etc., etc. So let me not spend too much on Bolzano, except for one thing. This is for Czech readers, for those who are looking through YouTube, I think. This is a really beautiful book. It's a own biography, autobiography by Bolzano, where you can learn such things as if you have problems with your health, you should start to read Euclid and then the problems disappear. And there are many others, quite interesting and in a gentle but clever way written, how he was fighting whether to go to theology or not. And then he decided, because he said that I have to do something which will most help to people. Now the first Bolzano lecture was by Cedric Villani, field medalist, and it was called Of Triangles, Gases, Prices, and Man. And it was in April, actually, 2017. The second one was in 2019, in May, given by Kip Thorne, Creating Gravitational Wave Astronomy. And I'm very happy to say that both these lectures can be followed on the web of the Learned Society. If you click on přednášky lectures, so then you can distinguish Bolzanova lecture series, and you can look at both these quite, I would say, even extremely interesting lectures. And so I was very happy that already 2 years ago in Cambridge, when I just mentioned to Martin Rees whether he would be so kind and to give the Bolzano lecture, so he was first a little bit hesitant, but now he is really here among us and will speak about the world in 2050 and beyond. I should say a few words about Martin. I think he's one of the best known, most outstanding and most influential cosmologists and astrophysicists on the planet of Earth. He was interested in black holes, he was interested in creation of first structures in the universe. He very much work devoted to energetic sources like gamma rays, etc., etc. You can look at his web page and you can see his papers, and it's always inspiring and interesting to look at it. He also wrote over 500 articles, scientific articles, and a lot of journal on disarmament, on scientific collaboration, etc., etc. And I should say and show you two things actually first, before I continue still about Martin a little bit. This is the book which was produced after the plenary assembly of Learned Society in 2015. And you probably cannot see the title. It's called O hvězdách, oceánech a lidstvu, on stars, oceans, and mankind. It's very pedagogical because on one side it is in English, on the other it is in Czech. So it's good at least for children who are learning English. And there is a long lecture, there are also discussions, but long lecture by Martin Rees on called From Mars to Multiverse. So this is more cosmological or astronomical lecture. In the sense, it will be different from today's lecture, although today's lecture concerns, of course, in some respect, much more general and important issues. I should say that today's lecture actually will be reflected in Czech literature as well. Martin wrote recently on the future prospects of humanity, which was produced by Princeton University Press. And this book is now in print, and it's prepared in Academia Press. It's called O budoucnosti, vyhlídky pro lidstvo. So it would be nice if you will be interested, if you can get in touch with this. Well, let me say very briefly, it's very complicated to characterize fully Martin. He was 5 years president of the Royal Society, probably the best known, the most traditional scientific academy existing in the world. Such people like Isaac Newton was president, Thomson, the discoverer of electron, etc., etc., Rutherford, I believe also. That was from 2000 to 2005, if I'm not mistaken. Then he became also master of Trinity College in Cambridge, and he was master for 80 years. And I should say this is without any doubt the best known college in England, and usually it was mathematicians who were coming to this college. So, for example, not only Isaac Newton was there, although he was not the master, but, for example, Bertrand Russell was there, and also actually whom Chandrasekhar calls the best astrophysicist of 20th century, namely Sir Arthur Eddington, also came from this Trinity College. Martin is a fellow or a member of a number of society, and I will not name all of them, but certainly American National Academy, and we are very happy that he's also a foreign member of the Czech Learned Society. At the end, I would like to mention two remarks which are quite personal. It was during the time of Iron Curtain that I could penetrate it about 3 times or so. It was always complicated, but it was only thanks to the invitation of Martin Rees. But that was not enough. He was so kind that when I suggested about 5 people whom it would be nice if he could invite, he did it. And so he was very much helping to our science. The last thing is slightly on joking side, but it's reality, it's truth. There was already no Iron Curtain. It was in 1995 when I was invited again to Cambridge, but before that to go to Loughborough. And this is a city north, there is also a university, and it was planned that I will be a few months there. Now, at the airport, I met a very special figure. And this special figure was Professor Ernst Gellner, very well-known anthropologist, who in fact was educated here in Czech Republic. He came from Jewish family, and they, of course, spoke in German, but he had big influence on developments here, because after '89, he was one of important personalities in this Middle European university. And also, interestingly enough, he was collaborating with Martin Rees' wife, Professor Caroline Humphrey, who is quite well-known astroanthropologist, coming very often to Buryaks and to the Far East. Now, we met at the airport. Ernst Gellner was very much agreeing that postmodern philosophy is really dead end, and even about Patočka we spoke, etc., whom he knew quite well. And we departed, and I told him that I will come to Cambridge later, but that I am going to Loughborough. I came to Loughborough, and then, to my great surprise, a postcard came. And in the postcard, it was written, Martin Rees just became the astronomer royal. However, he will not have to have velvet trousers and report about solar eclipse to the Queen. So that I assume that tomorrow, when there will be solar eclipse, at least 1/5 of the sun will be covered, Martin will be not on Zoom with Queen. So please, Martin, we are looking very much forward to your talk.
Yes. Let me first say what a pleasure and privilege it is for me to give this lecture. Bolzanova was not only a great intellect, but also a very admirable human being. And we can't say that is true of all the great intellects in science. And also, I have many friends in Prague, and particularly to mention Jiří, who I have indeed known for 50 years. And as I do have the title Astronomer Royal, some people think I do horoscopes for the Queen. But I have to say she's never asked me, and I'm only an astronomer, and of course, like most scientists, I'm not very good as a forecaster. I think all we can say as scientists is that we're better than economists as forecasters. But I have nonetheless, as Professor Bichak mentioned, written a book which is entitled On the Future, where I have discussed what may happen in 2050 and beyond. But the main theme of the book is this. It's that this century is special. It's the first in the 45 million centuries of Earth's history where the main threats come not from nature, but from one species, ours. And we have the long-term future in its hands. We're deep in what's called the Anthropocene. But let's first discuss 2 things we can predict, even with a cloudy crystal ball. First, the world in 2050 will be more crowded. 50 years ago, the world population was below 4 billion. It's now about 7.8 billion. And the growth has been mainly in Asia and Africa, and this distorted map gives each country a size proportional to the growth in population in the last 30 years. The number of births per year worldwide has in fact leveled off. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise from its present 7.8 billion to around 9 billion by mid-century. And that's mainly because those in the developing world are young. The histogram on the left shows the age distribution of people in West Africa, the right-hand side here in Western Europe. And the young people in West Africa, they'll live longer, they'll grow old. And even if they only have 2 children, then the population is going to grow up. But despite doom-laden forecasts made by the Club of Rome and others around 1970, food production has kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not to overall scarcity, even though the population's doubled since 1970. And to feed 9 billion by 2050 will require further improved agriculture, water conserving and GM crops, and maybe some dietary innovations, converting insects and maggots, highly nutritious and rich in protein, into palatable food, and making artificial meat and not eating real beef. To quote Gandhi, there'll be enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population projections beyond 2050 are uncertain. Falling infant mortality, urbanization of women's education trigger a transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be countervailing cultural influences. If, for whatever reason, families in Africa remain large, then according to UN projections, Africa's population could rise from 2 billion to 4 billion between 2050 and 2100. Nigeria alone would then have almost the population of Western Europe and North America combined. But optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses which will be most worrying. As compared to the fatalism of earlier generations, those in poor countries now know via the internet, etc., what they're missing. And migration's easier. So if Africa gets trapped in poverty, it's a portent for disaffection and instability. Multiple megaversions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. So many of us think that wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently instigate a mega Marshall Plan, like what the Americans did for Western Europe after World War II, in order to ensure that Africa doesn't fall behind. And we would do this not just for altruistic reasons, but to make a more stable world. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could irreversibly impoverish our biosphere. Extinction rates are rising. We're destroying the book of life before we've read it. And already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being. But preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So the world's getting more crowded. And as a second firm prediction, it'll get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, although it is under-acted upon. The basic datum is this famous Keeling curve, which shows the carbon dioxide concentration over the last 60 years and how it's risen by about 50%. The little oscillations are due to the fact that there are more trees in the northern hemisphere than the south. So in the northern autumn, CO2 rises when the leaves fall off the trees and falls again when the spring comes. But the important thing is the rising trend, which causes a well-known greenhouse effect warming. And the fifth IPCC report presents a spread of projections drawn here for the rest of the century. I won't go into them, but they are based on different assumptions about how much we burn in the way of fossil fuels in future times. But the main point is that some of these scenarios lead to a temperature rise, which is thought to be likely to lead to tipping points and really drastic, irreversible changes in climate. But there are uncertainties in the modeling, and the vertical bars on the right indicate the expected uncertainty in the model due to the difficulty of predicting the changes in cloud cover and things of that kind. But despite the uncertainties, there's one message that most would agree on. It's that under business as usual scenarios, we can't rule out later in the century really catastrophic warming and tipping points triggering long-term trends like the melting of Greenland's ice and rendering many parts of the world uninhabitable. But because the effect is slow, it's hard to get people to care enough about it. But we're like the proverbial boiling frog, contented in a warming tank until it's too late to save itself. And of course, not only do we have to deal with something which is several decades in the future, but the effect will be more drastic in places like Africa than in our countries in Europe. In fact, some of you may know the work of the Danish campaigner Born Lomborg. He's got sort of bogeyman status among environmentalists, which is a bit unfair because he doesn't contest the science. But he has a Copenhagen consensus, a group of economists, and he downplays the priority of addressing climate change compared to shorter-term efforts to help the world's poor. But that's because he applies a standard discount rate of 3 or 4% per year, which in effect writes off the importance of what happens beyond 2050. But that's not appropriate in this context. We should care about the life chances of those born today who will still be alive in the 22nd century. And other economists like Stern and Weitzman do this, and they therefore argue that it's worth paying a big insurance premium now in order to remove a catastrophic risk from those who are now young but will be alive in 2100. And unsurprisingly, of course, it's the young who expect to live longest whose clamour for action in climate is loudest. Their leverage on voters and the media is amplified by charismatic individuals, especially a rather sort of diverse quartet of Pope Francis, David Attenborough, Bill Gates, and Greta Thunberg. You can't imagine 4 people more different from each other than those 4, but they are people who have energized the public so that the public now cares more. And of course, politicians will respond to issues they think that voters care about. So that's why these charismatic individuals are important in amplifying the voice of specialist scientists. And this is a rather crucial year in this context because there's a crucial meeting on the climate in Glasgow in November and in Kunming in China on biodiversity in October. But to lend a bit of good cheer, there is a win-win roadmap to a low-carbon future. It's that nations should accelerate research and development into all forms of low-carbon energy and into other technologies where we need parallel progress. Batteries, compressed air, hydrogen, etc., and also smart transcontinental grids. And that should enable the countries in Europe where we have got good research capacity and in North America to reach net zero. We can, if we prioritize it, generate clean energy to get rid of fossil fuels. But there's something even more important, which is that the faster these clean energy technologies advance, the sooner will their prices fall, so they become affordable to all the nations of the global south. And those nations can't reach acceptable living standards without generating more power than they do today. we can get by probably with less per capita. But not only will the per capita energy needs rise in India and Africa, but they will collectively harbor 1 billion more people by 2050. So bending the trajectory of CO2 emissions from those countries is really, really crucial. They will need to leapfrog more speedily to clean energy rather than building coal-fired power stations, just like they leapfrog directly to mobile phones and never had landlines. And it will be hard to think of a more inspiring challenge for young engineers than devising clean and economical energy systems which can achieve net zero carbon for the world. We should be evangelists for new technology. Without it, the world can't provide food and sustainable energy for an expanding and more demanding population. But many of us are anxious that it's advancing so fast that we may not properly cope with some technologies, and that therefore we will have a rather bumpy ride through this century. Nuclear war still looms over us. The only consolation is that there are about 5 times fewer weapons and on lower alert than the US and Russia had during the Cold War. But there are now 9 nuclear powers and a higher chance than ever before that smaller nuclear arsenals might be used regionally or even by terrorists. And some claim that the command and control systems are getting more vulnerable to cyber threats. Moreover, we can't rule out, later this century, a standoff between new superpowers, which could be handled less well or less luckily than the Cuba crisis was in the 1960s. Nuclear weapons are 20th century technology, but this century has brought surges in new technologies, bio, cyber, and AI. Advances in microbiology, diagnostics, vaccines, and antibiotics offer prospects of containing now pandemics. And we're seeing this, of course, in the present pandemics. My number one fear, the prospect of engine groups in Wisconsin and in Holland, influenza virus, shown here, both more virulent and more transmissible. To some, this was a scary portent of things to come. And these gain-of-function experiments can be done in principle for coronaviruses. And the new CRISPR-Cas9 technique for gene editing is hugely promising, but there are ethical concerns about experiments on human embryos, for instance. And also, there are worries about the use of this gene editing to make certain species sterile. It could lead to runaway consequences. For instance, mosquitoes, which spread viruses, have been made extinct. And some nasty people think that the grey squirrel, which is a rather nice mammal in the UK, should be made extinct by making it sterile because there's a brown squirrel which is less able to compete with it. But regulation of biotech is clearly going to be needed on ethical grounds and on grounds of prudence. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed can't be enforced worldwide any more than drug laws can or the tax laws can. I worry that whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. And that's a nightmare. It's a nightmare because whereas an atomic bomb can't be built without large-scale special purpose facilities, biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups or even individuals by biotech and by cybertech as well, of course, will pose an intractable challenge to all governments and aggravate the tension between 3 things we want to preserve: freedom, privacy, and security. The global village will have its village idiots, and their idiocies can now cascade globally. And these concerns, I think, are fairly near term, within the next 10 or 15 years. What about 2050 and beyond? On the bio front, we might then expect 2 things. First, a better understanding of the combination of genes which determine key human characteristics, and the ability to synthesize genomes that match these features. If it becomes possible for biohackers to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. So-called designer babies may become conceivable in both senses of the word. And what about another transformative technology? Robotics and AI. DeepMind, a London company, had a computer which famously beat human champions in the games of Go and chess. It was given just the rules and trained by playing millions of games against itself in just a few hours. And this is Mr. Lo Kui, who is the Go champion who was beaten by the machine. But he has some advantages still. The computer used hundreds of kilowatts of power. He uses about 30 watts. Our brains are like a light bulb in power consumption. And of course, you can do lots of things apart from just play games. But already AI is benefiting because of the ever-rising processing speed. This is, in effect, the consequence of Moore's law, how the speed of computers has increased by literally billions and is still increasing. And that's why AI can cope better than humans with very complex, fast-changing, elaborate networks, traffic flows or electric grids. And to take another example, the Chinese could have an efficient planned economy that Marx could only dream of, which a machine could handle it and process every transaction and the inventory at every shop in real time. And AI can help science too. It's helped with the technique of protein folding, it helps with drug development, and it may perhaps even settle whether string theory can really describe our universe. The 10-dimensional geometry may be too hard for any human to do in a lifetime. But the implications of AI already in its present state are ambivalent. If we're sentenced to a term in prison, recommended for surgery, or even given a poor credit rating, we'd expect the reasons to be accessible to us and contestable by us. If those decisions were entirely delegated to an algorithm, we'd be entitled to feel uneasy, even if presented with compelling evidence that on average, the machines made better decisions than the humans they've usurped. AI systems will become more intrusive and more pervasive. The data may be used for benign reasons, for instance, for medical research, but its availability to internet companies is already shifting the balance of power from governments to globe-spanning conglomerates. And the incipient shift in the nature of work have been addressed in several excellent books by economists and social scientists. I won't go into that, but it's clear that machines will take over much of manufacturing and retail distribution. And they can supplement, if not replace, many white-collar jobs, routine legal work, accountancy, computer coding, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. But in contrast, some skilled service sector jobs, plumbing and gardening, for instance, require non-routine interactions with the external world, and it's very hard to imagine a robot doing them as well as a human. But to create a humane society, governments will need to vastly enhance the number and status of those who care for the old, the young, and the sick. There are far too few of these, and they're poorly paid, inadequately esteemed, and insecure in their positions. But those displaced from work in call centers or Amazon warehouses, if the big companies were taxed, could be re-employed by publicly funded posts as carers. This is surely the kind of thing we'd like to see happening. So that's a possible benign consequence of the shift in the need for labor. The arms race between cyber criminals and those trying to defend against them will, however, become still more expensive and vexatious. And ethical tensions are already emerging when AI moves from the research phase to being a potentially massive money spinner for global companies. For instance, the company DeepMind was an independent company in London, but it's now been taken over by Google, which perhaps doesn't have such sensitive ethical concerns that the founders of DeepMind have. It's, as I said, the speed of computers which gives them their strength. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images. Not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of multilingual text. Here in Europe, they're given EU documents. Their boredom threshold is infinite. But acquiring common sense won't be so easy for them, because that involves observing real people in real homes or workplaces. And the machine will be sensorily deprived by the slowness of real life. It's like watching trees grow is for us. So robots can't so easily acquire common sense, and they're still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard. They can't jump from tree to tree like a squirrel. But sensor technology is advancing fast. And this leads to a short digression. It's always harder to forecast the speed of technological advance than its direction. Sometimes it's a spell of exponential progress, like the spread of IT and smartphones in the last 15 years or so, but then there's an inflection or even stagnation. Let me give two examples. Alcock and Brown's first transatlantic flight was in 1919. The first jumbo jet went into service 50 years after that, in 1969. But 50 years after that, you still have the jumbo jet. And Concorde came and went. And another example, it was only 12 years from Sputnik 1 in 1957 to the moon landings. But 50 years later, there's still a high point of human spaceflight. Likewise, experts are getting less optimistic, I think, about how quickly stage 5 fully driverless cars will become acceptable. And the iPhone 20 may be not too different from the iPhone 12. But let's look still further ahead. What if a machine does develop a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or would it go rogue? Futuristic books portray a dark side where AI gets out of its box, infiltrates the Internet of Things, and pursues some goals misaligned with human interests. Some AI pundits take this seriously. For others, like Rodney Brooks, the inventor of the Baxter robot, who regard these concerns as premature. He thinks it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence will worry us more than real stupidity does. But be that as it may, it's quite likely that society will be transformed by autonomous robots, even though the jury's out on whether they'll be idiot savants or whether they will really display superhuman capabilities. The futurologist Ray Kurzweil, here he is, he argues that once machines have surpassed human capabilities, they could themselves design and assemble a new generation of even more powerful ones, an intelligence explosion, a singularity. In his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, he thinks this may happen before 2050. And he thinks that humans would then transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. We then confront the classic philosophical problem of personal identity. Could your brain be downloaded into a machine? If so, in what sense would it still be you? Should you be relaxed if your body was then destroyed? What would happen if several clones were made of you? These are ancient conundrums for philosophers that practical ethicists may one day need to address them. But Kurzweil, who's in his 60s, is worried this nirvana may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants and store it. So that when immortality on offer, they claim you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. I was surprised to find, in fact, that not only has Ray Kurzweil paid for this, but 3 academics in England had gone in for it. 2 paid the full whack. The third took the cut price option of wanting just his head frozen. I was glad that these were all in Oxford and not in my university, because I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard rather than an American refrigerator. But of course, research on aging is being seriously prioritized. And we have to ask, will the benefits be incremental, or is aging a disease that can be cured? Because dramatic life extension would plainly be a real wild card in population projections with huge social ramifications. But it may happen, along with human enhancement in other forms. It's surely on the cards that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through the deployment of genetic modification and cyborg technology. There will be designer babies. Moreover, the future evolution, a kind of secular intelligent design, would take place only in centuries, in contrast to the thousands of centuries needed for Darwinian evolution. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilization. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries from now will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. And now I turn to another technology, space. My favorite technology, and it's beyond our Earth, in environments hostile to humans, that cyborgs and AI have the most spectacular scope, and where I think these changes will happen fastest and should worry us less. During this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes far more advanced than the wonderful Cassini, which spent 13 years orbiting around Saturn and its moons, or the New Horizon probe, which sent back pictures of Pluto 12,000 times further away than the moon. Both Cassini and New Horizon were designed in the 1990s, and they took 10 years on their journey to their destination. Just think back to the computers and phones of that time and how much they've improved, and think how much better we could do in designing miniaturized probes to go to the outer planets. The next step in space, I think, will be the deployment of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures, for instance, giant telescopes or solar energy collectors assembled under zero gravity. But what about human spaceflight? The practical case gets ever weaker with each advance in robots and miniaturization. So will it have a resurgence? I cherish this photo, which was signed for me about 10 years ago by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. And of course, it's nearly 50 years since Schmidt and Kernan on Apollo 17, the last 2 men on the moon, returned to Earth. Hundreds more have ventured into space subsequently, but anticlimactically, they've done no more than circle the Earth in low Earth orbits, many of them in the International Space Station. And this only makes news when something goes wrong, when a toilet fails, or when they perform stunts like the Canadian Chris Hadfield, who played his guitar and sang David Bowie songs. So will there be a revival of anything inspirational involving humans? An Apollo-style project? Well, there's no denying that NASA's Perseverance, which landed recently on Mars, will miss startling discoveries that no human geologist could overlook. But machine learning is advancing fast, as is sensor technology. In contrast, the cost gap between sending humans on a long journey to Mars and supporting them remains huge. And another problem is that NASA's manned program, ever since Apollo, has been impeded by public and political pressure into being very risk averse. The space shuttle had 2 spectacular crashes in 135 launches. that's less than 2% failure rate, and astronauts or test pilots would willingly accept this level of risk. The shuttle had wisely been promoted as being safe for civilians. And because of that safety culture, NASA will confront political obstacles in achieving any grand goal within a feasible budget. If I were an American, I would strongly support NASA's robotic programs, but I'd argue that all human missions should be private enterprise ventured, not paid for by a taxpayer. I'd hope that Elon Musk's SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin could operate a cut-price program far riskier than Western nations could impose on publicly funded civilians. And there'd still be many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as many thrill seekers and, of course, early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And in this context, the phrase space tourism should be avoided, because it lulls people into thinking that such ventures are routine and low risk. And if that's the perception, the inevitable accidents will be as traumatic as those of the space shuttle were. The exploits must be sold as dangerous sports or intrepid exploration. And by 2100, some courageous thrill seekers may have established bases independent from the Earth, on Mars or maybe on asteroids. And Elon Musk himself, who's nearly 50 years old, he says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And 40 years from now, he may make this. But don't ever expect mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic, the top of Everest, or the ocean bed. And here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. I think it's a dangerous illusion to think that space offers an escape from the Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a big challenge, but it's really simple compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, I think we should cheer on any brave space adventurers who do go to live on Mars. And that's because they'll have a pivotal role in spearheading a post-human future in the 22nd century and far beyond that. And this is why they'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat. So they'll have a more compelling incentive than those of us on Earth to redesign themselves to a different atmosphere, different gravity, and all the rest. And they'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyber technologies which will be developed by then. And these techniques will, one hopes, be constrained here on Earth on grounds of prudence and ethics. But these settlers on Mars will be beyond the clutches of the regulators. And we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to alien and hostile environments. So it's these spacefaring pioneers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead the post-human era which Kurzweil envisages. I'm often asked, do astronomers bring a special perspective to global issues? Let me explain why I think they do. We're all familiar with this time chart depicting that we and the entire biosphere are the outcome of about 4 billion years of Darwinian evolution. But many people who accept this history nonetheless somehow think we humans are the culmination, the top of the tree. But no astronomer could believe this. That's because the sun is less than halfway through its life, and the cosmos may have an infinite time ahead of it. I like to quote Woody Allen, who says, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may be nearer the beginning than the end of the emergence of ever-growing complexity, some of it having attributes that our brains can't conceive. This raises, incidentally, the question that astronomers are most often asked. Is there life out there already? Or is the galaxy waiting for our progeny? Not humans, but these post-humans. We all agree that we don't know. Indeed, not quite all. I get letters from people who say they've met the aliens or been abducted, etc. And I write back to them saying, do you really think that if the aliens made the huge effort to get here, would they just meet one or two well-known cranks, maybe make a corn circle, and then go away again? Seems unlikely to me. I tell them to write to each other and not to me. The rest of us all agree we don't know, but we do know that there's no way in our solar system which could harbour advanced life. But what about simple life? There could be some freeze-dried bacteria on Mars. Indeed, that's one of the things Perseverance is looking for. And there may be creatures living under the ice on Saturn's moon Enceladus, or indeed on Europa, which is a moon of Jupiter. But let's widen the horizon to the realm of the stars. And here we've had a big transformation in the last 20 years. We've learnt that all these stars aren't just twinkling points of light, like the sun, but they are, like the sun, surrounded by retinues of planets, just like the sun is surrounded by the Earth and the other familiar planets. So there are lots of places where life could exist. And especially interested in twins of the Earth, there could be many, many millions of them, which are the same size as ours, on orbits with temperatures such that water neither boils nor stays frozen. Habitable doesn't mean inhabited, but that's the number one question. But that's a topic for a different lecture, or maybe the question period. Is there life out there already, and will we detect it? Let's come back to the Earth. Here's another time chart. The left-hand side of it is what I showed before, but this illustrates that there is a much longer time span running into the future. But even in this time frame, stretching billions of years into the past and the future, this century is special. As I said at the beginning, it's the first when one species, ours, has the planet's future in its hands, and where our creative intelligence could jumpstart the transition from an Earth-based to a spacefaring species, and from biological to artificial intelligence. Transition which could inaugurate many billions of years of post-human evolution, even more marvelous than what's led to us. On the other hand, we could trigger bio, cyber, or environmental catastrophes which foreclose all such potentialities. But what should our message then be to the younger generation? Surely there's no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable world where all can enjoy a lifestyle better than those in the West do today. We live under the shadow of new hazards, but these can be minimized by a culture of responsible innovation, especially in fields like biotech, advanced AI, etc., and by reprioritizing the thrust of the world's technological effort: better plant growing, better energy generation. So we can be technological optimists, but the intractable politics and sociology engender pessimism. The scenarios I've described, environmental degradation, unchecked climate change, and unintended consequences of advanced technology, could trigger serious, even catastrophic setbacks to our society. And our world is so interconnected that a collapse, societal or ecological, would be a truly global setback. Given these stakes, such threats shouldn't be ignored. We should be mindful of Nate Silver's maxim, the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And I think scientists have an obligation to promote beneficial applications of their work and warn against the downsides. Universities should offer their staffs expertise and convening power to assess which scary scenarios, echo threats, or risks from misapplied technologies or pandemics can be dismissed as science fiction, and how best to avoid the serious ones. In fact, we in Cambridge have set up a small centre, now about 20 people, to address just these issues. And most of the challenges are global. As we're seeing from COVID-19, pandemics plainly are a global challenge. And the threat to potential shortages of food, water, and natural resources, and transition to low carbon can't be solved by each nation separately, nor can the regulation of potentially threatening innovations. Indeed, a key issue, I think, is whether in a new world order, nations need to give up more sovereignty to new organizations along the lines of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Authority, etc. Well, that's what I want to say, but let me just end with a flashback, right back to the Middle Ages. This picture shows Ely Cathedral, which is about 10 miles away from where I live. I could have shown any cathedral, including ones in Czech Republic. But for medieval people, the entire cosmology, from creation to apocalypse, spanned only a few thousand years. They were bewildered and helpless in the face of floods and pestilences, and they were prone to irrational dread. And of course, they only knew about a small part of the earth. But they built these cathedrals, constructed with primitive technology, by masons who knew they wouldn't live to see them finished. Vast and glorious buildings like this one, which still inspire us almost a millennium later. Well, our horizons in space and time are now vastly extended, as are our resources and knowledge. But we don't plan centuries ahead. At first sight, that seems a paradox. But there is a reason. Medieval lives played out against a backdrop which changed little from one generation to the next. They were confident that their grandchildren would appreciate the finished cathedral. For us, unlike for them, the next century will be drastically different from the present. We can't foresee it, so it's harder to plan for it. There's now a huge disjunction between the ever-shortening timescale of social and behavioral change and the billion-year timescale of biology, geology, and cosmology. So, spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support systems vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. This pale blue dot in the cosmos is a special place and maybe unique, and we're its stewards at a especially crucial time. And that's an important message for all of us, whether we're astronomers or not, because we need to think globally, and we need to think rationally, we need to think long term. We need to be good ancestors, empowered by 21st century technology, but guided by values that science itself can't provide. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Martin, for this most impressive talk. It's nice that there were also some elements of optimism in all this picture. And let me now ask for discussions, questions. Okay, Pavel Kroupa, I understand. Sorry, so it's Jan Polák, actually. So it does not seem to work.
Oh, thank you very much. This is Jan Polák. I was just clapping my hands on congratulations on such a great lecture. Thank you very much. I was just clapping my hands in an online environment.
Okay, well, so there is one question which is here coming from YouTube. From one point of view, we can say, sorry, let me change my glasses for distance to glasses to reading. From one point of view, we can say that life is about avoiding systematic risk, nuclear wars, pandemics. How important do you see artificial intelligence in context of uncertainty and unquantified systematic risks? Are we talking about low probability and potentially high negative impact for life on the Earth?
Yes. Well, I think if it's under control and not too advanced, then AI can help us, as I mentioned, to deal with complex systems. But if it gets out of control, or if it has some bug in it that we can't cope with, then it is dangerous. I mean, I think the main problem with all these technologies is that they're so complicated, and if something goes wrong, then it can cause a cascading catastrophe. And I think excessive dependence on things like this is dangerous. I mean, let's take another example. During this pandemic, if the internet had gone down in a big way, that would really have made life far harder for all of us. And there was, in fact, in my country yesterday, there was an event. Something went wrong in one of the server companies, which knocked out the internet for a couple of hours in lots of big companies and in the government. And so these sorts of things can happen. And I think we've got to make sure that if we do depend on these very complicated systems, someone understands them and we build in redundancy. Indeed, I think if you ask what can we learn from COVID-19, there's a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. I mean, to take two examples, it's efficient to have a single supply chain and not keep stock up just-in-time delivery. But of course, if one link in that chain breaks, then you end up not being able to manufacture some important entity. So it's far better to have multiple supply chains and stock up a big inventory, although that's more wasteful. And similarly, it's not sensible for a hospital to pride itself on keeping all the beds full. It's important to keep a fraction free for some real emergency, as I think the Germans did more than other European countries. So I think we've learned lessons that we've got to have redundancy built in. Otherwise, striving for efficiency can make the world more fragile. And so we have to plan somewhat differently in our priorities.
Okay, thanks. So are there some other questions? Yeah, Pavel Kroupa.
Yes, so I do have a question now. Hello. Yes, is there any estimate of what the maximum temperature could be through the driving, which is now happening, through the increase of the CO2, the methane? So could there be a tipping point where the temperatures increases, to a point where we have a really global mass extinction, plankton dies off, oxygen supply disappears for some time. Life won't disappear, but...
Yes. Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but certainly, of course, the figure that's quoted is just some global average, just an indicator, but it indicates massive shifts in weather patterns as well. But certainly, the highest of the four graphs I showed in my slide would correspond to a temperature rise on average of up to 6 degrees by the end of a century. And there might be tipping points then. And of course, the system is so complicated that even if we do stop now and eventually try to bring down CO2 again, it's not guaranteed it'll go back to the state it was. There may be multiple equilibria. And I think it's important to keep modeling the Earth's climate. It's so complicated to try and understand this better. But for the moment, I think we've got to be cautious, because we can't rule out these very drastic effects by the end of a century.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, well, so Mr. Sikora?
Good afternoon or evening.
Hello.
It was a very nice lecture, talk. I have two simple questions to you. One of them is, you mentioned several problems as you see them. Which, if you have to select the biggest one, which is the biggest of those you mentioned? This is the first question. Second question is related to my feeling that you are a little bit nervous about artificial intelligence, how people are using it. And then the question is, I mean, what do you see as a continuation of humankind? I mean, because we have this evolution, right? So after a few millions years, if there is still Earth, right? What do you expect will come after people? And maybe it is coming right now, and it's just speeding up as you were presenting on the development of computers or artificial intelligence. So don't you? But what is your expectation? Is there something what will come from the nature? I mean, natural, or from us as a humankind? Due to our development of artificial intelligence? So two simple questions. Thanks.
Yes, well, lots of questions. First, on what scares me most. I mean, I worry most about sort of malign bioengineering, releasing viruses more lethal or more transmissible than even the real ones, which could cause global catastrophe. I also worry about cyber attacks, because we're so dependent on these systems that it's easy to imagine some event that could lead to massive social breakdown. I do worry about those things. But turning to the other longer term question about evolution, I think it's clear that for humans, standard Darwinian evolution has really stopped, because we keep alive people, etc. But my point is that the changes in humans will depend on the extent to which we are willing to redesign the genome and maybe have cyborgs plugging in extra memory into our brains and all that sort of thing. The extent to which we're prepared to use technology, both biotech and cybertech, to enhance humans. That's one thing. I personally rather hope we won't allow those things, and we'll keep the Earth changing as slowly as possible and bring down the population. But as I said, wish good luck to the crazy pioneers who go to Mars, because they will certainly want to change themselves, and they might become electronic entities, and if they are, they'll be near immortal, and then they can perhaps make interstellar voyages without being daunted by them. So I think that the far future is going to be dominated by electronic entities, and incidentally, SETI programs looking for intelligent life, if they find anything, it's more likely to be something electronic rather than the fairly short-lived flesh and blood civilization which preceded it. So I think that future intelligence will be electronic, and so it won't be Darwinian, it will be designed. And incidentally, this is relevant to the Fermi paradox for those who are interested in that, because it's normally said, if there are intelligences out there, why haven't they visited? But I think the point is that Darwinian evolution requires two things. It favors intelligence, but it favors aggression as well. And this sort of intelligent design will come later. It may favor intelligence, but it may not favor aggression. And so there may be some brains out there thinking deep thoughts we can't even conceive, but having no wish to be expansionist. So that's the kind of outcome, because in principle, there's going to be more scope for improving brain power, in a sense, electronically than through flesh and blood. Although, of course, there is a fundamental question. Can we be sure that consciousness is just a property of emergent systems, or will they not be conscious? And that makes a huge difference to how we react to this idea. I mean, if these entities are superhuman in their capacities and in their sensitivity and their self-awareness, then we should applaud that, and we're just a step towards it. But if they are zombies, then I think we would be sad if they take over from us, because it would be so sad if the word entities that could appreciate the wonder and universe in the way we can. So that's an answer to your various questions.
Thank you for your answer. It's like End of a Childhood from Arthur C. Clarke. Yeah, it sounds like this, but thanks for your view.
Right.
Okay, there is Mr. Milienko
Semelic, thank you. Do you hear me? Yes. So thanks for the lecture. And yeah, you almost answered my question, because my question was exactly, this is anthropocentric, what you were saying, that there are no aliens who want to take water from us or something, or everything. So shouldn't we prepare for that? On which side, because Stephen Hawking said that we should beware of them, shouldn't we prepare a little bit for the aggressive ones?
Well, I mean, I put it very low on my list of things that we prepared for. Perhaps we should, but we've got absolutely no idea, because I think one point we've got to realize is that there's no reason why the human brain is able of understanding all the most fundamental things about the world. There could be concepts which are crucial to the nature of reality, which are beyond human brains, just as quantum theory is beyond a monkey. And so, for that reason, we've no idea what might be out there, if there are entities which have got beyond the state of paralleling what humans have done. So I think if we have no idea whatever, then it is hard to know how we plan.
Thank you.
There is a note here by Andrea Kotelova saying, thank you very much for this great talk and for a very nice introduction. I'm looking forward to the new book. That's all. Is there any question?
Yes.
I have just one remark, Martin. Do you know what's special for Czechs is in Ili Cathedral, which you projected, as you showed us? If you go from the altar on the left-hand side to the entrance, you will find there a grave, and above this grave is written, I don't know who was that, but what is written there is, he was offered the kingdom of Bohemia, but he rejected it.
Huh. Really, I didn't know that. Okay. Yes, but you've been there. You've been there, obviously, haven't you?
I was there several times. In old days, on bicycle, yes.
Yes. Usually, perhaps I could share one final memory of Prague and view that the first time I went to Prague was in 1967 when I was a research student, and it was a memorable occasion because this was the IAU, International Astronomical Union, which met in Prague, and it was the first big meeting I went to, and it was a very special one because this was a year before the Prague Spring, but Zeldovich and Sonyaev and all those people were able to attend, so it was a wonderful opportunity for me while still a student to first of all see Prague, but also to have an opportunity to see the great researchers from Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. You probably remember the same event. It was really very, very, very special.
Yeah, I do. I met there first time Hermann Bondi, who also came. And I remember I published one paper in the Royal Society just before that, and he recommended it. And the paper was reworked very much. I mean, it's English by Bill Bonner, and by typical English gentleman. And Bondi turned to me and said, oh, you wrote a very interesting paper. Only that English should be better. You know, so...
A bit unfair, yes.
So a German, Austrian, Hermann Bondi was correcting English gentleman, Bill Bonner. Yes, it was a very special meeting, and it was a very special time for Czechoslovakia in those days, here is another question. Biotech, AI, nanotech, all existential threats. Other great risks may not be yet known. What do you think is the probability humankind will make it through the 21st century without destroying itself?
Yes. Well, I'm going to hedge my bets. I mean, I would say that we will have a bumpy ride. We will have disruptions which are far worse than COVID-19, either pandemics or breakdown of infrastructure, etc. So I think we will have a bumpy ride. But I think it's pretty unlikely that anything would happen that would wipe us all out. You can conceive things that would, but I think that's pretty unlikely. But the question is, will there be a transition to such an unstable world that the values and the expectation of progress may be weakened compared to what we've had up till now. So I'm worried about whether we can cope with these new technologies. I'm also worried about the fact that we are more interconnected and we can have a disaster which starts in one place and no other part of the world will escape from it. So I do worry we're getting more vulnerable and interconnected. So I would just say a bumpy ride, but the question is, will we end up at the end of the century with still some humans, perhaps better than now. And I think what I would say in general is, going back to my analogy with the Middle Ages, the Middle Ages were pretty miserable for people, but there wasn't very much that they could do to improve their lot. They had no medical knowledge, etc. Whereas now, although we are better off on average than people were in the Middle Ages, I think there's been no ethical progress, because the gap between the way things are now and the way they could be is, I think, wider than it was back then, because now it's clear we could provide for everyone in the world the kind of life that we enjoy in Europe. And we're not doing this. And we have the richest 2,000 people in the world whose money could double the income of the bottom billion in the world. And they're not doing this. So I think I would question any claim to great ethical progress on the national level, even though there has clearly been progress compared to the Middle Ages in the condition of life of the average person.
Well, okay. Well, let me ask also one question which is more astronomical. I know that you liked very much to consider anthropic principle. You even organized a meeting in your place. What is your today's view? Because there are some people who are interested in it, and when it stopped working, in any case. I remember Weinberg, ironical story. So you certainly were interested in these things. So what is your today's attitude?
Well, I think we should be open-minded. I mean, I should just explain the two things. We understand the Big Bang, but we don't understand the physics of the very, very early stages of the Big Bang, when the physics was very extreme. And it's at that stage that the content of the Big Bang and its basic geometry were determined. But we know that there are some models for the physics which lead to many Big Bangs. The best known is André Linde's theory of eternal inflation, which is based on specific assumptions which can't be tested yet about the very early physics. And he has many Big Bangs, and so our Big Bang may not be the only one. And so there could be other universes. But then there's a second question, which relates to some string theory ideas, where they have the idea that there is more than one possible vacuum state, more than one different state for space. And those different vacua would have particles in them governed by different physics. So if you believe in Linde's model, and also in some version of string theory, then you would imagine lots of Big Bangs giving rise to different universes, but governed by different laws. And then some of them would be sterile or stillborn universes, whereas some would allow the development of complexity, as has happened in our universe. And the question is, how special do the conditions have to be in order to allow complexity of any kind? And I think we need to have a force of gravity, but it's got to be very weak so that you can have quite big entities that aren't crushed by gravity. You probably need to have some sort of periodic table so that you can have chemistry. If the laws of nature didn't allow any stable nuclei apart from the proton, then we could have stars, and we could have galaxies, but we couldn't have any complex chemistry. I mean, the only kind of intelligence you get then would be Fred Hoyle's Black Cloud, if anyone's read his science fiction. But we need some requirements for any kind of complexity, but we don't know what they are. It's rather fun to explore these counterfactual universes, I think. And I think we should be open-minded about the possibility that the universe, which we call the universe, is just a tiny part of physical reality in this grander sense.
You still believe it would go through the Karl Popper definition or requirement for science, that it would be refutable?
Well, I mean, I think it could be, because we could have a theory which applies at 10 to the 16 GeV, which we can test, because if it predicts the masses of the proton and things like that, then we take it seriously, and then we would take seriously whether it predicts something like Linde's theory. And so, I mean, you don't have to be able to test all the constants of the theory, because to take Einstein's theory, we believe that because we've been able to test it, but we therefore believe what it says about the inside of black holes, even though we can't test it there. Likewise, we could have a theory of the physics of 10 to 16 GeV, and if it has consequences in the low energy world that we can test, then we take it seriously, and then we would believe it if it predicts many Big Bangs rather than one. And of course, some people don't like the idea because it would mean we're further from a picture. I mean, I like to quote Kepler in this context, because Kepler, of course, famously thought that the orbits of the planets were fundamental and were governed by beautiful mathematics, the something regular solids, and it was in a sense sad that the orbit of the Earth is not specified by anything like that. It's just one of the many possible orbits within which water can exist and life can emerge. And it may well be that on a cosmic scale, we're going to have the same transition. Rather than saying that the laws governing the universe are very special, it could be that there are many different Big Bangs which are governed by different laws, and we just happen to be in one of them. And it's one of the subset which allows complexity and life to emerge.
Okay, very general view.
Some people may not like that, but that may be true. I don't think one should rule it out.
I know that Donald Lynden-Bell would not like it, but
no,
yeah.
No.
Okay, so are there questions more? Okay, if not, so thank you very much indeed, Martin, again, for this beautiful lecture, for this long and nice discussion, and I'm sure people will look forward to academia when it produces your book and can read it then with all full details. Okay. So best wishes, best regards.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much indeed for the invitation.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
Right.